Now, let's give it another example. Let's say that we have employees. And this could be a good example. So we say we have employees, and I really like the show Bob's Burgers. So I'm going to use Bob's Burgers here as an example. Let's say we have different departments. We've got the finance department. And in the finance department, we actually have a list of people. What if we've got Bob, we've got Linda, and we've got Tina, all in finance. We can also have another department. Let's have IT. So again, that's the key. And the value is going to be this list that we're putting in there. So Jean, Louise, and we'll throw Teddy in there as well. And that one, and let's do one more. We'll do HR. So HR, and we'll put in here Jimmy Jr., and we'll also put in Mort. Again, you can put whatever you want in here, and if you need to pause, if you're trying to follow line for line, word for word, you need to pause and type this out, feel free to do that. I'm going to go ahead and print out our employees just to show this. Make sure I type this all right because this is a lot of syntax. And we've got finance, IT, and HR. Looks like we did a great job. Awesome. So let's say I wanted to add a new key value pair. I could do that in a couple of different ways. We can do something like employees, and we can just say something like we want to add a legal department. All right. And in the legal department, we're going to have just one person. We'll just have Mr. Frond. He's our legal team. Okay, we'll just say adds new key value pair. Save that. Actually, let's print employees so that way we can actually verify. Save, print. And you can see legal adds Mr. Frond. So we are adding to the end of our dictionary, just like we added to the end of our list. Everything gets appended to the end unless we specify otherwise. Let's go ahead and come in here. Another way that we can do this is we can say something like employees.update, and we can say something like give it a sales department. And in the sales department, we'll have Andy, we'll have Ollie. Close that off. We're also going to have to close off our curly braces, and we'll close off our parentheses. And if you have a decent notepad, it'll show you where your items are, so that way you know you're closing things off correctly. So we've got 3 different types of syntax going on there, and it sometimes can be hard to read. So here we could say adds new key value pair as well. So just another way of doing it, we can print employees, and we'll see that Andy and Ollie should be added provided we typed everything correct, which we did. So here's sales with Andy and Ollie. Okay, one more thing. Let's say that we wanted to update something in our dictionary. We're going to go ahead and update a value. We're going to go back to drinks for this one. Let's say that inflation has happened, which it has. And with inflation, the price of a White Russian has now gone up from $7 to $8. We can do something like that, print drinks, and you should see that hopefully this has been updated to $8, which it was $7 before. Now it's $8. Perfect. We can also grab the value of that. So if we wanted to do something like print drinks.get, and then we do White Russian, we could totally do something like this and save, and hopefully it will return 8. And it does. So that is it for this lesson. We're going to go ahead and move into a new file here in the next video. So let's go ahead and save this and close this, and we'll prepare for the next video. So I'll catch you over in the next lesson. Okay, so I wanted to talk about importing. We're going to talk about importing modules. So I wanted to make a new file for this. Let's just call this mousepad importing.py or whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to do the ampersand here. And again, if you're using Windows or Mac, just make sure you create a new file for this. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add my shebang like before. I'm going to declare bin python 3 and save this. And now we're going to go ahead and talk about importing. So importing, let's type this, importing. And we'll say importing is important. Now, modules exist within Python that are built in but not available to us without importing them. So like you saw us being able to do math, but we could import a more robust module of math and then use that to do more advanced calculations outside of adding, subtracting, exponents, etc. In this instance, we're going to talk about a couple of different imports that we can do and that you're going to see again as we get into some of our hands-on stuff and we build out some projects. For example, we might want to import something called sys. Now, let's say if we tried to print out sys.version, and we'll just save this, and then we're going to python 3 importing.py. And you're going to see that I get an error back that says sys is not defined. Name sys not defined. Okay. Well, sys is something that we're going to use quite often in Python. You're going to see it imported quite a bit. And it does a lot of different unique items. Like it does something called argv, for example, which we'll use as an example later on. But if we want to specify an amount of arguments, say we're trying to run Python 3, we're going to do a port scanner later. So we'll just say port scanner.py, and we need to supply an IP address here, right? And this is argument 0. This is argument 1. So if we supply no argument 1, then we're going to throw an error. It's going to be an if-else statement, and that's going to use something called argv. Now, we'll get into that later, but that's very important, and it's a part of sys. Another part of sys is doing something like the version type of Python that we're using. Or another thing is the sys.exit, which you'll see later on as well, which is going to allow us to gracefully exit when we encounter an error, we tell the script to exit, or whatever we're doing. So we might need to import something like sys, or another one is os, which is very common to be imported as well. So let's talk about importing. In order to import, we can say something like import sys, just like this. And we can just say this is for system functions and parameters. Save that. And let's go ahead and just print this now and see what happens. You can see now that sys has been imported, even though it wasn't built in automatically, we can import it, and you can see now it tells us, hey, we are running on version 3.10.5 of Python, and it was downloaded on June 8th, 2022, or built on June 8th of 2022. So from here, let's go ahead and import something else. Let's go ahead and import date time, and we can import from something. So I know this is going to be confusing, but we can import specifics from a module. So we're just importing the date time feature from date time. Even though they're named the same, just know that we can import specifics. We don't have to import the whole thing, even though we totally could just import the whole thing as well. So here, for example, we can say print datetime.now, like this. And you know what this is going to do? It's going to tell you what the date and the time is. And I apologize, this is backwards. It's from date time, import date time. So again, your syntax will tell you where it's wrong, and it is perfectly normal to make mistakes. I leave these in the videos so that you see that I am human too, and it's completely normal to make mistakes like this. So go ahead and do your script now, and you'll see that it gives the date and the time. So right now it is July 6th and it is 2 o'clock in the morning. I am a night owl. Now, one other thing that we can do is we can come in here and we can from datetime, import datetime. And we can also give this an alias. We can say as DT. What if we don't want to write datetime out? We just want to do DT. Just like we didn't want to write new line out, we did NL. Same kind of concept. So we can just say import with alias. And instead of saying datetime.now, we could just say dt.now. Save that. Go ahead and print it. You can see it still works. So absolutely the same thing. We're just giving it an alias, making it a little bit easier to run. Okay, so that is it for this video. Let's go ahead and close this out, and then I'm going to meet you in the next video when we're going to talk about sockets before we get into building out a port scanner. So I'll catch you over in the next video. Okay, so let's make a new file, and we're going to call this s.py. And again, create this however you want to. If you're using Linux, you can follow along like this, or just create a new file in Linux or Windows. Again, we're going to shebang this up here. I'm going to give this a bin Python 3. Now, this isn't incredibly necessary if you're running on Windows or Mac, but this is just best practice for me. This is the location of my Python. Even though I'm not actually calling it, I am calling it with Python 3. So this isn't incredibly relevant as long as you're using Python 3. Now, we are going to deal with sockets. So sockets. Now, sockets are what can be used to connect two nodes together. So we're going to use this to connect to ports and IP addresses. If you're unfamiliar with computer networking, that's okay. But what we're looking for is a port, and we're going to look for that port on an IP address. And on that IP address, if that port is open, we're going to make a connection to this. We're going to build a port scanner in the next video or later on in the lesson, and you'll see this in action. Right now, I just want you to notate, understand what we're doing, and then I'm going to demonstrate an example that you do not have to follow along with, and you might not be able to follow along with. So that's okay. But just know that sockets are used to make a connection between ports and IP addresses, and you'll see that here very shortly. So you do not name this, by the way, socket.py. If for some reason you came in here and you named this socket.py, this will break Python because we are going to import socket. So make sure that you come in here and you rename this if you named it socket.py. It's very easy to do that, but that will break the socket.py, which is what we're importing here. So with this, we're going to set a couple of variables. We're going to say host is equal to 127.0.0.1. And this is our loopback address or our home address. If you're not familiar with computer networking, I do recommend that you go take a class on computer networking because it will become very important as you get into Python development, especially if you ever work with nodes of any sort. So other thing is ports. So we have ports on our machine that we can connect to. We're going to be using TCP. If you do not know what TCP is or what the ports are, that's okay. You can still follow along, but know that there are 65,535 available ports. Some ports are very common in what they use, like port 80, for example, is a web server over HTTP. You have 443, which is HTTPS. 21 is FTP. There's a lot of common ports and protocols that are out there. We're going to pick a non-standard port, non-common. We're just going to say 7777. So what I'm going to tell this to do is I want to tell this to reach out to this host, which is just going to be us for this example, and this port. I want to make a connection on this port. Now, I'm going to give a variable of s, and this is going to be a very long statement. So if you say socket.socket, I'm going to type this out and then I'm going to explain everything, okay? So socket.af inet. Then we're going to say socket.sockstream. And then just for your notes, AF inet is IPv4. Sockstream is a port. So we're giving it this S because we are not wanting to type this whole long thing out all the time. We're just shortening this. What we're going to do is we're going out to make a connection to this AFINet, which is IPv4 IP address, which is what this is. And we're going to also make a connection on a port, which is our sock stream. We're going to give it this port. We're going to say that by doing s.connect. And we're going to come in here, and this is going to be a tuple. So we're actually going to use double parentheses here, host port. Okay, and we could come in here, by the way, and we could just put in 127001 instead of using a variable. But I like to use variables because it's best practice, but you could hard code this in if you wanted to. But here, I just like using the variables. Easier to change, especially if you're coming in here and you're writing in a bunch of host port calls to the variable. It's easy just to have it in one place as opposed to hard coding this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. This is where I do not expect you to follow along because you might not have the architecture behind it. Now, as I stated in the beginning of this video, I am an ethical hacker by trade, which means that this version of Kali that I've been running on, or this version of Linux that I've been running on, is actually Kali Linux. And in Kali Linux, we have a bunch of tools available to us for pen testing and ethical hacking. One of those tools is a tool called Netcat. Now, Netcat is NC, and basically what it does is allows us to connect to open ports or establish a listener on an open port. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to open up a new tab here, make this bigger, and then I'm going to run this here. Just understand, if you've never used Netcat before, that's fine. I'm just opening up a listener on a port. That's all. Just worry about the L and the P for now. Listen on port 7777. Anybody makes a connection on that port, we're listening. So we are going to connect to ourselves because we wrote the script out to 127001, which is us. And all we're going to do is Python 3 s.py, hit enter. Nothing's going to happen. We don't have any print statements, anything crazy. But you can see that a connection was made from 127001 to 127001. And it made a connection on this port, and we connected on the other side on this other port here, which don't worry about that too much. If you're not familiar with networking, that's absolutely okay, but there has to be two ports being connected, one on one side, one on the other. So here, we made that connection. We didn't tell this to do anything else. We just said, hey, go out, listen for this connection. We made a connection, we established it, we did our job, we used our socket, and we are good to go here. We closed the connection because there was nothing, no instructions given or anything else, and that's all we needed. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, in the next video, build out what I call a terrible port scanner, and we'll talk about why it's terrible, but we're going to tie everything we've learned so far together and build something out that is actually usable with Python. So been throwing all these lessons and terms and everything out to you. Now we're going to apply that, and you're going to see how we can use that all together, and I'm very excited. So I'll catch you over in the next lesson when we start building out a port scanner. It is time to create our first project. And this project is going to be building out a terrible port scanner. And so let's go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to call this scanner.py. Give it the ampersand here if you're on Linux. And then we're just going to call this then Python 3, save it, get the pretty colors going. And what we are going to do is we are going to create a scanner that is going to be something like this. We're going to type in Python 3 scanner.py, and then we're going to say IP address. We want to provide an IP address, and then it's going to go out and do port scanning on that IP address. So hopefully we can build that out. For now, let's go ahead and import a couple of things. I should say a few things. We're going to import sys, talked about sys. We're going to import socket, talked about socket. And from date time, we're going to go ahead and import date time. So none of this should be new to you. So first thing that we're going to need to do is define our target. So we need to set up an if statement. I'm just going to say define our target. And what I want to say is if the length of sys argv, and I'll explain this in a second, is equal to 2, then we're going to set a target variable. Target is going to be equal to socket.getHost by name. And we're going to say sys.argv1. And all this is going to do is translate host name to IPv4. All right. Let me make the else statements. I'm going to come back. I'm going to explain everything, okay? So if we do else, we're going to print out invalid amount of arguments. And also print out syntax Python 3 scanner .py IP address. Something like that, okay? Go ahead and close that off. Okay. So we're taking a method of length and we're saying sys.argv. We spoke a little bit about argv in the importing section. Argv is going to be the amount of arguments that we are giving. So when we come in here and we type in Python 3, okay, our first argument, argument 0, in theory, is going to be scanner.py. The second argument, or second index, index of 1, is going to be the IP address that we give. So 192.168.1.1 or whatever it might be. So we need to have 2 arguments. If we have a third argument, it's going to break. If we don't have a second argument, it's going to break. If we just type in scanner.py, it'll break. If we type in an IP address, like 1.1, and then we type in something here, it's going to break because there's too many arguments. So if it doesn't meet this specific length, then what we're going to do is print out invalid amount of arguments. Here's the syntax. Give somebody some help here. If it does meet the length, then what we're going to do is we're going to set our target equal to socket.getHost by name. And all this is saying is we're going to get host by name of sysargv1. That's our IP address. Now this is going to translate a host name to an IPv4. So in case, for example, if you did Python 3 scanner.py and you had a host name like I have a host in my house called Punisher. Like if I gave it Punisher and my DNS knew internally that that translated to a specific IP address in my network, that's fine. This will translate. Okay, easy enough. But we could also just give it an IP address. So that's what we're looking for here. I highly recommend for this example using an IP address. In previous lessons, when I've taught this before, somebody has tried typing in a host name and it doesn't always go as planned, though we will talk about adding error exceptions for that here in a little bit. So right now, all we need to know is we're trying to set this up with these arguments. Now, this is not the best logic. This is something that will work for our needs because we are building this out. But if we're building this out for somebody else, this logic's not great. And this is why I call this a crappy port scanner, is because it's not the best. We're only doing it for proof of concept and to learn what we've learned so far. But think about this in another way. Think about if we're running 2 arguments. Well, I could give this an argument. What if I come in here and I say Python 3 scanner.py and I give it the second argument, but I give it like 192.1 or something like that. Well, that's not a host name. It's not going to translate to anything. That's also not really an IP address. So we should really add some other statements in here to say, hey, it needs to be a valid IP address. It needs to be like have 4 octets like we expect. And if we really wanted to get critical about this, we can make sure that it is a valid IP address, because IP addresses can start with like 256 dot whatever. So we could say it must be between each octet must be between 1 and 254 and get really refined with that and say, hey, that's not a valid IP address. Thus, we're not going to scan this. But we don't have to worry about that right now. I'm just saying the logic behind it, we need to start thinking about, well, how can a user break this? We know how to run it, but if we gave this to somebody else, how would they run it and how could they break it or how could they typo something? So these are things to think about as we go. So for now, we've added this in. We've got this in here. We could test this if we just save it. We come in here and we just say Python 3 scanner.py. We don't give it any arguments. You'll see that it says invalid amount of arguments, Python 3 scanner.py is the syntax. Perfect. Don't give it an argument right now because it's going to break if you don't have DNS translating properly. So from here, let's go ahead and add a pretty banner. So just add a pretty banner. And all I'm going to do is do a print command. And I'm going to just do a bunch of dashes. This is not really going to be that pretty of a banner, but it's still going to be a banner. And so when this kicks off, if we've got a valid IP that we're going to be scanning, we're just going to do scanning target, and then we'll just do a space. And you could just do a concatenation here of plus target. You could do F string if you want. Completely up to you on how you want to do this. So we just do scanning target plus target. This will say what the IP address is. We can do like scanning target of that, something along those lines. And then we could say print time started. And then we can give this something like a string. So we want to give plus a string of date time dot now. Remember, we can't concatenate numbers and strings. So we're going to go ahead and do this. And then we'll just print out this one more time. Okay, I'm going to save this. Let's go ahead and try running this with like, I don't know, 192.168.1.1. Okay, so this is what we get. We can see that we have scanning target. Okay, scanning target 192.168.1.1. Here's the time that it started. Perfect. We've got a pretty banner set up. So now let's actually start making it do something. So we're going to use what is called the try command. We're going to try something, and if it works, perfect. If it doesn't, we're going to have exceptions for that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to say try for, we're going to do a for loop, port in range. Remember we talked about a range earlier. We talked about, well, what about a for IP in range of 1 through 254? We're doing the same concept here. Now we're just giving it a range. Now there are 65,535 potential ports. I'm not going to force you to scan all those. If you want to, you can come in here and say 65,535. This is not threaded. We are not doing any sort of speed runs here. This could potentially be a slow port scanner. So it is best, in my opinion, to do like a port scan between 50 and 85. And the reason I do this is because we're going to scan or attempt to scan our home router, and usually DNS is open on that, and usually port 80 is open on that. So I'm trying to look and see if we can find a couple ports that might be open. So for port in this range, what we're going to do is we're going to set our S equal to that lovely socket.socket, socket.afinet, and socket.sock_stream, just like that. And then we're also going to come in here and we're going to do a socket.set default timeout to 1. So if it responds back or doesn't respond back within a second, we're just going to move on. We don't want to stick to scanning a port, waiting for it not to respond back to us, and then the script takes long and longer and longer. So we just want to make sure that we set our default timeout to 1 there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set a variable of result. And result is going to equal to s.connect _ex, and I'll explain all this in a second. Target and port. All right. So what this is doing here, actually, let me type out the rest and then we'll go back. We're going to say if result is equal to 0, we're going to print out port. We can do is open. So now we can come in here, we can do a format port if we want to. You could use an F string here if you want to. So we can just use an F string. So I'm just showing you examples, but you can say port and just do an F in front of this. Okay, port, whatever is open, and then we're going to close the connection. All right, let's read through this, make sure we understand what's going on. So we're going to do a for loop for port in the range of 50 to 85. So we're going to start with 50, then 51, then 52, go through that process. We are setting a variable of s equal to this because we're going to gather the IPv4 address and we're going to gather the port that we're trying to connect to. Now, our IPv4 address, here's our tuple right here. We are saying I want to connect on target and port. Target is going to be supplied by us. We're going to use argv1. So we're going to supply the IP address, and the port is going to be this range here. So for port in range, we're declaring port here. Now this s.connect_ex. This is an error indicator. So if a port is open, the error result returns 0. If a port is closed, it returns a 1. So if the result is a 0, we're going to say, hey, this port was open. If it's not, it's going to close out, and we're going to close this. Then we're going to go back to the loop and come through and try it again. So we're going to close out our socket connection on that port, come back, try 51, 52, etc., etc. Now, before we run this, there are some exceptions that we need to consider. So the first one, we're going to try this, but we need exceptions. So except, what if we have a keyboard interrupt? So we'll say keyboard interrupt. And that just means, what if we hit Control-C while this is running? We can stop this on our own. So we're providing an exception of a keyboard interrupt, and we're going to say exiting program on a new line. And then we're going to sysexit. Remember, I talked about sysexit, and we're going to allow us to exit gracefully. We can also do an exception of a socket.gai error. Now this is what happens when the hostname does not resolve. So what if we say hostname could not be resolved? So if we typed in a bunch of mumble jumbo up here, we say like Python 3 scanner.py, and we just typed in something and that doesn't resolve to an IP address. Well, guess what? This is going to throw an error now, and we can exit. We got to cover all of our bases. Lastly, what if we have a socket.error? So we have an error when we're doing this, and we print out, hey, we could not connect to the server. It's just not online. What if we try to connect to an IP address and it doesn't talk back to us? Could not connect to the server. So something to think about there. Again, we'll sys.exit. So let's go ahead and save this. Now, you're going to need to run this against something. So I'm going to show you an example of mine. Okay, so in order to run this, we need an IP address. Now, if I type in ifconfig, I'm actually on a virtual machine right now. So 192.168.138.140 is not my true IP address. I'm actually going to bring up my Windows machine that I'm on. And you can see here that I have a default gateway of 192.168.4.1. So make sure you know your gateway or what your router's IP address, or that you have a machine that you can scan that you know might have a port of 53 or 80 open, or you need to modify your script to make sure that you can scan for something. But I'm going to go ahead and scan my 4.1 because it should have some stuff open.